Welcome everyone to UE Bristol's Disability History Month event. This is a really exciting talk that we are going to be having, and from the feedback that we've had from staff and students, there was a specific real interest in us exploring more invisible disabilities within the context of disability. So this is really great that we are able to have one of our own academics sharing their expert knowledge around the field. I'm Louise, I'm the Staff and Student Engagement Officer within the Equality, Diversity and Inclusivity team. My role is to support the delivery of history months across the university and with a variety of other different responsibilities. So this is why I'm here today and my role for today's event. Here at UE Bristol, we know that we have so much more work to do in terms of disability inclusion, but we're really, really proud of what we have achieved so far. We're really committed to ensuring that everyone who studies and works here is able to be themselves, bring their diverse identities into the UE community, and experience welcome, belonging, and an environment that enables us all to give our best and access opportunities equally. This session today is going to be specifically exploring about working with and for autistic communities in research. Again, it's going to be hosted by Nigel, who I'll be passing on very shortly. I will be sharing at the end or mid the end of this a short questionnaire for you to fill in. This is for us to be able to measure our impact of our engagement programs. So I would appreciate if you could take a few moments for that. But again, just thank you so much for attending and joining us today. And I will now there'll be opportunity, to ask questions at the end, but I'll now be passing on to Nigel.
Thanks, Louise. Appreciate it. And appreciate you inviting me. I'll share my screen in a second, but thank you for sort of reaching out and asking me to give a brief talk today about how I've involved autistic people in particular in the research I do and the sort of value that brings. And I'm also going to talk a little bit about the sort of conflict that also raises within research agendas as well. So I'm going to, like I say, I'll flick to my screen sharing now, and hopefully somebody can confirm you can be able to see what I see. So can somebody just mention that they can see the screen at least? Is that there, Louise, for you?
Yes, can see that.
Thank you. So I'm just going to go full screen there. So thanks a lot. I appreciate that, Ian. So today's session, I've been allocated an hour and a half. And when I was putting this together, I felt that maybe a bit overkill. So the whole hour and a half is dedicated to a bit of me talking about some of the research I've done and some of the approaches that I take and the perspective that I have on this particular condition, autism, and how that feeds into, like I say, my research agendas and how I have sort of spent the last 5 years or so looking to place the views and the perspectives and the voices of those individuals, at the center of my research to help drive my research. And I hope that might provide some, some interesting insights and or prompt some interesting comments or discussion points afterwards. So I'm going to hopefully talk for about 45 to 55 minutes, I guess, and leaving some time at the end then for some commentary, for some discussion, for other people to feed into the discussion, I guess, because I think I would equally value feedback on the sort of approach that I'm taking here and any sort of issues or positive sort of context that people see with this type of approach that I've adopted in my research. So first of all, just a bit about me. I'm a senior lecturer in the Department of Education and Childhood at UE, as Louise mentioned, and I've been working with autistic groups and technology-based research with them for about 12, 13 years now. And a lot of my work, as I will talk about, is situated in places where autistic people could meaningfully engage with technologies, and I'll come to what that means a bit more as we go through. But essentially, I'll be talking about how we can better consider the voices of autistic groups in research and the benefits this brings, but also some of the tensions that exist within both practice and research. And ultimately, I'll be talking about how there's issues particularly within research in this area, in terms of how research articulates into practice. And that is a big sort of concern that I have. And like I say, I'll be picking up on some of the tensions around that and why that exists. So like I say, I hope that's of interest to people today. And Louise, if anyone comes in with messages as we go, please feel free to jump in and just to kind of flag stuff as we go. I can answer questions as we go if that's a format that will stimulate some discussion. But I'll leave that up to you, Louise, to curate as you see fit.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you. There's my email address is there and my Twitter handler. So please do feel free to reach out if there's any sort of further comments or points of conversation that people want to have. I'm a very discursive person, very happy to always meet new people and to meet other people researching a range of areas and or in practice settings and to have further conversations. So please don't feel shy to reach out. So like I've said, I'm going to cover some of the sort of research that I've undertaken and the ways I've involved user groups. I'm going to provide some and sort of talk about some of the lessons that I've learned from that and the takeaway messages. I'm going to provide some suggestions and thoughts on ways we can better involve a range of stakeholders in research and like I say, the specific benefits that that's given me and given the field in this particular space. And when I talk about this field and space, like I say a few minutes ago, my work is predominantly focused on the application of innovative technologies with autistic populations. So I'm particularly focused around that domain of research, and that's the domain of research I'm going to be sort of specifically referring to, I guess. But before I do that, I'm just going to provide a bit of a sort of a more overarching approach to how research within this field of technology and autism has kind of started, where it's come from, and the sort of approaches that it's taken and how that feeds into models of disability. So this is a nice quote that's something quite recent by some researchers, where they talk about the growth in autism research necessitates corresponding attention to autism research ethics, including ethical and meaningful inclusion of diverse participants. And this is something that I think really resonates in terms of the work I'm doing and I'm interested in doing. And I totally agree with this statement, and I certainly reinforce the idea that as researchers, we have an ethical obligation actually to make sure we have meaningful engagement with our participant groups. The idea that we can kind of research about people and gain insights to them without kind of feeding into a range of different debates and conversations around that, and even if is that the right way to do it, which I'll be talking about in a second, really does sort of stand out for me. And I think this inclusion of diverse participants is really really important in the work that I do, and I'm really committed to making sure that is, I will slam my fists on the table quite hard in terms of ensuring that point is addressed in research I'm involved with. So just a little bit of background about autism, just for those of you who may not be familiar with the condition, and just as a point of reference in terms of terminology here, I will go between terms such as autism and autistic, which reflects recent research in this field that suggested that people with this condition don't have a preference for either or of those ways of describing the condition. So I will go between the two, but I just wanted to flag that. So autism is a lifelong neurodevelopmental condition that impacts how a person perceives, communicates, and interacts with the world. It's characterized by significant and lasting differences in social communications and interactions. And it also involves a restricted and repetitive nature or patterns of behavior and special interests and activities often. There's also linked with this sensory perception and responses to sensory overload, which can also impact autistic individuals. Now, there is also worth pointing out that within the autistic community, about 70% of them will often struggle with language, maybe not being verbal at all, or have significant challenges with their language and have associated learning difficulties. So in terms of the sort of perceptions you may see, in the movies or on, in films around how autistic people can behave, it's worth recognizing that there is a substantial sort of percentage of this community who do struggle with a range of intellectual differences connected with the criteria that's listed above there. In terms of the impact of this condition, at least 1 in 100 people worldwide are impacted or would have an autistic diagnosis. In the UK, that's about 1 in 66, and in the US, that rises to about 1 in 54 in certain states. Now, this isn't research that represents, nobody's researched the entire world's population and done this sort of analysis, but in terms of research that has been undertaken, these are the figures that come out of studies that have been undertaken in different parts of the world. So on average, about 1 in 100, right the way through to about 1 in 54 people could be impacted with this condition. In the UK, it's estimated, or the National Autistic Society estimates, that would impact at least 700,000 people, to include the support networks, family carers, around people with autism. And that obviously, in a larger country that America is, that goes up to about 5.6 million in the US actually being autistic. So this is a condition that is, fairly prevalent. It's, obviously we've become better able to diagnose and understand and to work, all those sort of issues mean that it's more prevalent per se, but it's more detected now. We're more able to appropriately detect and then from then support. In terms of sort of a ratio of who this impacts within that context, we often find about 5 to 1 in terms of male to female, in terms of who sits on the autism spectrum. And that's for various reasons that I won't go into now, but at the moment, that's the type of sort of split between male and female people with this condition. So that's just a bit of a backdrop in terms of what this condition looks like, I guess, and the sort of characteristics that an autistic person would have. Now, I do want to approach this issue. We're here to talk about this sort of Disability Awareness Month, and I think it would only be right to pull out this sort of debate that exists, certainly within autism research, broadly speaking, but very much so in autism and technology-based research. And here there is a big difference between the medical and the social models of disabilities. And as you will probably all be aware, they're quite different and they're often opposed and they often pull in different directions. And I just want to sort of talk about that for a second to kind of set the backdrop for where certainly I position my research and I see the opportunities within this space. So I'm afraid the medical model of disability doesn't particularly sit well with me at all. In fact, it's completely opposed to the type of position that I take on this. But I think it's worth just pronouncing both of these in terms of what they are. And the medical position is very much that, unfortunately, the disabled person is a problem. That, for example, they are housebound, they can't use the stairs, they can't use public transport, that mainstream schools are too problematic for those particular individuals, they can't communicate properly, and that they need help. So that's a medical proposition or position of disabilities, broadly speaking. But the social model, which is much more where I position my work and certainly see my ontological perspective, if you like, is that the problem is actually with how society is arranged and not the person. So it positions issues with the societal context rather than the person. It talks more about discrimination and segregation being prevalent. It's more that public transport and stairs and houses are inaccessible, not that the people can't use those, it's rather that they are inaccessible and not built or made to be accessible in the right ways. Often the social model positions barriers to things like employment and to education, which I'll talk about shortly a bit. It talks more about segregated schooling being a problem. And it also talks about, I'm sorry, the little video icon is across that. It also talks about the lack of communication preferences and modifications being an issue rather than somebody not being able to communicate properly. So it's looking less at the person being a problem, obviously, here, which is something that is very, very completely opposed to the position I take. And it's looking at much more that the society has been constructed in a way that excludes often a lot of people with disabilities. So I wanted to flag that, and I'll talk a bit more about that as we go through. So this, in terms of thinking about within autistic contexts, unfortunately, the medical model and the medical way of thinking versus the social way of thinking, again, isn't much different. It's not much better. It's completely polarized. And what we often see within autistic-based contexts is we actually see the medical-based models are obviously driven top-down as well. And what I mean by that is within research contexts, researchers have often researched about people with autism. They've approached that from their perspective. And they've approached that, unfortunately, using this term in a way to fix people with autism. And we'll look at where the research sort of endeavours have been most closely focused, and hopefully that will pronounce that point a bit more. But unfortunately, the idea that, again, the child is faulty, that the impairment becomes a focus of attention, that therapy is imposed, that segregation and alternative services are provided, as again very much a medical-based way of looking at autism, whereas the social model again looks at the child being valued, the strengths actually of people and with differences being the focus, and not the challenges that they have. Identifying barriers to develop solutions, outcome-based program designs, the relationships are nurtured, and so on and so forth. So again, this sort of medical versus social model comes right the way through disability research, and it very much features in autistic and autism-based research. So again, one of the main issues that we see in this field, particularly, and like I say, that feeds through to the research that that I'm connected with in terms of technology-based endeavours, is again this idea that they need fixing, and why can't they adapt to us and to our world? And that's very much not a position I take, and that's very much, I would consider that a very old sort of historical view, but unfortunately that is not necessarily the case, which is something I'm going to be continuing to talk about as we go through this. So I wanted to kind of identify that difference that exists within, like I say, disability research broadly. So within autism-based research, we still see a perspective that comes through the research, and it is still fairly commonplace, I'm afraid to say, is that especially with technology, we're using technology to help fix someone with autism. We're helping to use technology to plug a gap in terms of something they can't do, which is something that I'm going to talk more about, how we have moved away from that approach to help enrich our research ideas actually, and to work with autistic communities much closer. And with that position comes this, as I said, this sort of top-down approach. In other words, we know best, we're the experts, we know what you need to be able to do to give you a better quality of life and to give you better outcomes. So there's this top-down approach. It's driven by researchers and researchers' agendas often, and this is often a result of funding agencies and how they prioritize research. And this medical-driven agenda that I've been talking about comes about predominantly because that's where a lot of the funding is located. And we see that across many countries in the world, that if you want to get funding to do this type of research, you need to often talk about the type of research that I'm describing here that I don't ascribe to. It's driven by types of research being more valuable as well. So there's more emphasis placed on medical-based, quantitative-based, large study-based research which is considered to be more valuable and robust. And again, that is very much puts to one side the notion that actually qualitative-driven research, so getting the words of people out and getting the stories of people out to the fore, is not as robust and not as valuable as that sort of quantitative, large data set driven type research. So often in this field as researchers, we're tackling with issues around trying to convince funders that, working with small groups, with small populations of autistic people to understand what their voices might tell us in terms of the research, that is often a difficult sell in terms of funding agencies. And so there is a real issue, and there's a real shift needed in research funding to enable researchers to couple with, I think, a drive that is a lot more valuable in placing autistic voices at the centre and people with disabilities, more broadly speaking, at the centre of research. So like I say, taken together, all of those issues and those perspectives and those paradigms that kind of permeate and kind of feature quite strongly in research through funding, through perspectives and so on, often means that people with disabilities, broadly speaking, and in the case I'm talking here, autistic people, often means that their voices are excluded, that they are not included, and in actual fact, they are excluded, because there is no endeavour at all to include their voices. So another issue with autistic-based research or research within all the field of autism is that often younger groups are excluded for various reasons. That could be ethical reasons. It could be that they are groups that are more challenging to work with in some cases. It could be that trying to articulate with younger groups provides researchers with issues that they're not willing to confront. So there can be a range of different issues with younger populations. Non-verbal autistic people are often who can struggle to communicate, effectively in inverted commas, or to communicate with neurotypical researchers who are, which is often the case. Those voices are often neglected in research, and research in this field has tended to shy away from working with non-verbal or people who struggle with communication and language because it's difficult for them to communicate with them, right? So again, it's this perspective of, it's difficult for me to do, so why would I want to do that with you? So again, that is another section of this community who's often neglected. And older groups as well. To the other extreme, older autistic populations are often excluded from research for a range of reasons and in a range of ways. Now that's changing. A lot of this is changing in the field of autism research at the moment, but we're in 2020 now, moving into 2021, and yet things are still not moving quick enough. They're still not moving in substantial enough ways, in my view, and some of the evidence I'm going to talk through next helps to maybe sort of provide a bit of a backdrop for that. So like I say, taken together, the research evidence base around autism and technology in particular is very medical driven, and it has these agendas through a range of different reasons that I've started to allude to, from things like funding models to the difficulties communicating with some autistic populations. So it's been a very medical driven sort of field to date, and the research evidence base is mainly driven by this, where we only have a very small social driven agenda attached to some of this research. Now, like I say, that has been changing, and we do see positive change in some of those areas, but like I say, and as I'm going to talk about, maybe not quick enough. So some research that was undertaken recently, I say recently, you'll see the date there, by researchers at University College London. Actually, they actually did they looked at the landscape in terms of autism and research, and they wanted to understand what were the priorities from researchers' perspectives and what were the priorities from the autism community. And what they found was were most research is classified into these sort of 6 areas around diagnosis, biology, brain cognition, causes, treatment and intervention, services, and societal issues. So you can see there's a range of different research types that were identified and fed into what they identified as being the most predominant research agendas in this space in terms of funding. And here, this gives us a sort of a snapshot of what they found across there. So you can see, for example, one thing that stands out for me here is that the United States, for example, spends almost 90 times more money on autism research than the UK, which was quite interesting. And as you can see below, that translates into about £4.20 per autistic person in the UK versus, almost 75, 76 pounds in the US. Now, this is quite a crude way of looking at it, and I do understand that, but it just starts to give a kind of a landscape picture in terms of where research is targeted and focused. And if we go to the next set of data that they provide, and this is really revealing, and again, you can see that there's this focus around the diagnosis, the biology, and the causes, and to some extent treatments, which I think I'll talk about a bit separately. But you can see a clear preference to where the research funding is going over the last 5 years that they looked at here, I believe. And you can see there's a huge priority and preference placed on this biological context and cause context. So understanding more about the brain, the way people think, the cognition, those sort of issues, and actually, in some cases, looking at how they can cure autism. I am really afraid to say that is where some of the research has been focused in some medical domains over the years. And as you can see towards the bottom end of here, services and societal research is very low compared to that. And looking at the UK's sort of percentage of funding and how that prioritizes that, you can see it's even lower than the US. So that's quite a problem in terms of looking at where the funding landscape has been positioned since 2007 to 2011. And I think, that represents a problem, and that represents the sort of issues that I was highlighting at the beginning in terms of the ways that we need to talk to funding agencies to get funding that's going to support the groups we're working with. So, but something else that they did pull out of their research was they went into the autistic community and they started to understand from both autistic individuals, carers of people with autism, and also researchers in this space. And they understood a bit more, wanted to understand a bit more about what their priorities for research were. And as you can see here from some of these comments, started on the left-hand side. This is from an early career autism practitioner. They talk about the fact they don't think many researchers feel that they can talk to autistic people as if they matter. They're too busy studying them like specimens or looking for a cure. And that goes on then to thinking, or listen to what the autistic woman said, where she just said that researchers are more keen on collecting data but not providing results. So there's an issue there about articulation of research back into the communities we're working with, which I'll talk about later as well. And the mother of a child with autism here says she would like more details on the results of research, particularly when she has given time and effort to help him with it. So again, there's this ethical dilemma, I think, in this space, and disability research space more broadly, that when we're working with these populations, how are we ensuring we're feeding back, we're representing, and we're sort of thanking them for their time, if you like, or acknowledging their time, and spending time after the research has taken place to feedback what we've found and how that can improve outcomes, or can improve access to services, or can improve, or whatever the issues we were looking at, how is that fed back into those spaces? And likewise, a mother of an adolescent with autism here says most of the research centres on high functioning Asperger's type of autism and is not relevant to her son's life in this case. So again, as I mentioned, research in this field has prioritised working with, as it says here, higher functioning Asperger's conditions because they're often easier to work with. Yeah, and we can communicate more effectively with them as researchers. So often, in this mother's case, she felt that her son's needs were not being met and she was not being involved in research in the same way that other people were. And an older autistic man saying here, it's important for research to have practical outcomes. So again, this is the idea that what does our research data tell us and how does that feed into policy, practice, strategy, and into actual outcomes for autistic individuals? And that's an issue that this autistic man articulated. And finally, an experienced autism practitioner here says some of the researchers have been informative and collaborative, which is good, but others have no interest with practitioners need, with what practitioners need or have to share at all. And again, that's a real issue when we start to think about how our work articulates into practice and can start to change practice and influence practice. And that's something that has been very much left by the wayside in this particular area. And like I said before, I think broadly speaking, in disability fields, that is something that researchers often research with their populations and then they'll leave them behind in many ways. And I think, again, that's an ethical dilemma. And again, I'll talk a bit about the journey that I've been on and how I extend my research beyond that, or how I consider my research to be extended beyond that. So talking a bit about the work I've been doing now. So I'm going to switch the talk into discovering or revealing, I guess, a bit more about what I've been doing and how I've been doing it. And like I say, this is situated within technology domains. And in particular, you can see here that immersive technologies. But I'm going to take a stand back and look at work I was doing earlier over the last sort of 10 years or so in this space. And what I want to sort of highlight here is that some of the issues I've been talking about, regarding medical versus social models, the sort of prevalence of research, looking at sort of fixing people coming from the top down. These issues do exist within the technology space. And the views of people with autism, their caregivers, support networks have not been central to research endeavours, and certainly not been as central as I argue they might be or should be in technology-based work. Still, we are neglecting perspectives and preferences, and I'll talk about that later with some of these groups. And we're not always working in situ, as I call it. So we're not always working. A lot of people still work in their research labs. They still work in universities. They still work online. They're not going into schools and working. They're not going into centres and working. They're not going into places of employment and working, if that's where their research should take them. So with this technology-based research, we're still working in labs and bringing people into our labs and researching about them more than with them. So the work I do is all about going into in situ spaces where we can actually explore what this technology and what this work might look like in those spaces and what the challenges therein might be as well. So really, and I think that really much feeds into the idea that sometimes there is little or no ambition to have research feeding into or connecting with practice or policy because it's done at such distance, often physical distance, but also in terms of headspace difference, and the sort of research questions that are being approached don't clearly and easily enable that practice to policy and that practice to research gap to be closed. It's still quite wide at the moment. So just a little bit of background. Some of you may be aware of this already, but the reason we use technology, and we've used technology for quite a few years, and I think I've got a map of what that looks like, but we use technology with autistic populations because they often feed into, I'll jump to the last point first, but often because they feed to the strengths of the autistic community. And by that, I mean the predictable and controllable nature of technology can appeal to autistic characteristics. The fact that they're not always socially complex and they're not unnecessarily complex can, again, appeal to autistic strengths. They can be less worrying and less stressful for some, and they can, as a result, they can often represent a space to test and to therefore remove the stresses associated with real life consequences. So we've used technology in this space. We've seen it be used for a range of different reasons, and one of those has been to sort of rehearse and to test things out without those real life consequences. And that removes a lot of stress and worry for autistic people. They're often less complex working with people face to face, and we know that autistic people can sometimes struggle with working to decode and to understand facial expressions and to understand the complexities and the nuances that people sometimes display. So again, working through a computer interface or a mediated computer interface can sometimes alleviate some of the issues associated with that. But like I say, ultimately, the way I look at it is that the things I've described are the ways that we can use technology to play to the strengths of the autistic community in many ways. And we've seen people making, well, anyway, I'll talk about the employment context as we go through. But this is a field that has existed for about 50 years in terms of research and in terms of evidence emerging. So this is still a growing area. I mean, 50 years sounds like a long time, but when we think autism was first described in the 1940s, 50 years of research using technology isn't that large. And actually, the research that's been done in this space has been quite piecemeal. It's been quite scattered. There hasn't been much joining up, and there hasn't been, as I say, the endeavour to place autistic people at the centre of this research. Much of the research across these 50 years has been targeted on the role and use of technologies to, again, fix or overcome issues that have been seen as core deficits in people with autistic children. And this includes areas such as social functioning or to reduce problematic behaviours, which is not a focus for some of the work I've been doing. And as a result, the narrowing of research focus has reinforced this view that autism is a medical deficit or in need of correction in some way. And as a result, has lacked in the design of technologies that are geared towards the interest or the needs of autistic individuals. And in fact, it's even neglected to take their views into account almost every step of the way. I don't mean to generalize here. This is much of the research. There have been some excellent examples, and you see the three authors there, for example, have made incredible strides into this space. Sue Fletcher-Watson up at Edinburgh University, Sarah Parsons at Southampton University, Sue Cobb at Nottingham University, along with Chris and Katja here, have all made really big strides into this space and sought to place the views of autistic individuals more central and valuing this social model of disability much more in their and our research. But as I said, it's not the predominant driving force that feeds this research agenda with autism, unfortunately, yet. So just as a general sort of overview, as you can see here, this research is something that's existed for a while, since the 1970s, when we saw multimedia, as it was called then, you might call it digital media now, technology using bespoke design technology to help teach reading, communication, understand human voices. And then we saw in the 90s work using head-mounted displays, which I'm going to return to shortly. Then we saw a prevalence of a mix of virtual environments, virtual worlds, multimedia technology, and then we saw obviously touchscreen technology with the introduction of iPads and other touchscreen devices becoming available. And we start to see sort of this smorgasbord, if you like, or this sort of scattered approach to looking at different types of technologies. But you will notice one of the things that I'm going to return to is this sort of virtual reality head-mounted display technology, which we've been interested in exploring further. And it was, as you can see here, first explored in the 1990s, 96 in the States. So this just gives you a sort of a sense of what that picture looks like across the last 50 years or so. And like I say, the evidence has been building. The evidence has been substantial in some spaces and not very substantial in others. And so what we don't really have is a set of clearly defined things we can say technology does well. And we're still exploring that. And as I argue, as we move through this, working with our autistic communities and their stakeholders and caregivers and other people who support them will give us better insight to design and develop technologies for the future, and technologies that can actually be deployed successfully and technologies that can be used successfully, because we see a huge issue with articulation into deployment and continued use. So I am just going to talk a little bit about one project I did several years ago, which was looking at a virtual world. And as many of you will be aware, well, in this context, we use something called Second Life. And a virtual world is essentially like a game that you're represented. I'll flip to some pictures here. You're represented by an avatar. You can see some characters on the screen here. You're represented by the avatar, and you can kind of see yourself in the third person. And you could navigate around a virtual space, which can be anything you want to design. And in this case, we designed this with autistic children. And in that space, you can communicate, you can undertake a bunch of activities that and again, in this case, that we built. So just coming back a second. So what we wanted to do here was, in this particular piece of work, we wanted to work in a school. We contextualized this as educational technology, and we wanted to look at social and communication contexts in this space. And we wanted to really understand through a case study approach how users with autism engaged in the design of their avatar and their virtual world, what their communication preferences were in the virtual world, and what types of communication and social interactions they had in this space. So this work was undertaken, I'm trying to rack my brain, 2008, 9, 10. So the idea that back then we were starting to use the word "their" in this and kind of look at this from their lens and through their perspectives was already starting to be something that was of interest in the research. And you can see here through these images that we worked in situ, again, as I called it. So we went into the school and we developed hardware-based technologies and we developed software-based technologies, and we worked hard to embed those technologies in schools. And I'll return to some of the challenges around that later, because for any of you working in schools or in educational contexts will know there's a hell of a load of issues with adopting or putting technology in schools. I hope I can see lots of heads nodding because there is a challenge that we did have to overcome, actually. And what we did here was we designed a range of activities for students to work in pairs, and they were split across different parts of the room. And through the virtual world, they were asked to complete a range of activities, and a lot of those involved social communication contexts. But before that, we got them to design their avatar because we wanted to understand about how they designed, or what effort or what energies or what focus they had in terms of designing their avatar. Now, one of the important things with this piece of research was, before we sort of parachuted in or dropped in, as a lot of researchers tend to do in this space, I actually spent 6 months before doing any work with the students in the school just to become somebody who they were used to seeing. And I think, again, effective, the idea that researchers can just suddenly parachute in at any given time, and that can be quite unwielding to autistic groups. And this was a special needs school, so everyone in the school had an autism diagnosis, and just parachuting in and seeing somebody strange for the first time and expecting you to work in quite a natural way with them can be challenging. So I spent 6 months in the school for a couple of days a week, every week, to become more embedded, to observe what they did, to understand how they operated, to understand the individual differences. So we worked with a case study group of 10 students, and to understand what the differences were, the nuances were, what some of the preferences were. So we wanted to really capture some of that knowledge and insight to help feed into what we then next did, which was to design this virtual world with the pupils. And what they wanted to see was a range of different things on this island. We had a private island to ensure that the safety, so nobody else from outside the classroom could join into this space. So we had this this island, as it's called, and we asked them what they would like to see, and they came up with some quiet areas to decompress, some eateries, a market, a fun fair, a zoo with animals, and another fun fair with other group activities. So they identified a range of spaces that they could see or imagine on this island. And then working with them, we co-designed what that would look like and what type of animals they would have, what type of spaces they would have. We had everything from bowling alleys to train stations to a fun fair to a Ferris wheel to a water rafting ride, as you can see here, to a zoo with some animals, right the way through to, as I say, to some coffee shops. We had a McDonald's sort of built in there, if you like, and we had other quiet spaces built for them where they could relax. So we had a range of spaces that we built in conjunction with them, and then we assessed essentially how they navigated the tasks that we set them. And what we found was, which wasn't, it was revealing at the time, but essentially text chat was their preferred form of communication, and actually a confidence to use this text chat. Although it's for some of them proved problematic initially, over time they became more confident and grew in the ability to be able to communicate using text chat. And that very much picked up on work that had already been done in the space to some extent, where data suggests that using text chat, using any sort of mode of communication on a computer that can slow down the communication process and can remove that sort of face-to-face sort of context, that, you know, the awkwardness that can come with that. And sometimes, again, we found a real sort of preference to using this format of communication, which was revealing. We also found that the communication increased over time as familiarity increased, and again, that points to this idea that, you know, the more confident and the more predictable and the more used somebody with autism gets into a space, that maybe the more confident they become. But we did also locate that the teacher's role in the virtual world was really important. She started off not being in the virtual world, and she ended up being in the virtual world, and that helped elicit a lot of sort of communication and facilitation with the work that they were asked to do in those spaces. So the participants overall reported feeling comfortable and happy to widen their social group in this space to friends or parents. So we started to sort of see that this technology was teasing out, and again, feeding into some of the strengths, feeding into some of the preferences, and providing a space and a voice. And we actually had somebody who was non-verbal in the real world, in the classroom, starting to talk and starting to use the text chat facilitation to talk to their teacher, to talk to other people in his class, because he just felt more comfortable doing that. So again, it's this idea of preference and providing a range of different opportunities. So we saw technology being quite enabling here, and I'll come back to that word enabling shortly. So I'm just conscious of time, so I'm going to speed up a little bit as we go through this, and I don't mean speak quicker, but I'm going to just sort of go through some of this work. But what did emerge from this, which was a bit unexpected, was the idea of how we could embed this technology in the school. So we developed a framework where we identified the steps, I guess, that should be taken to embed this type of technology in schools, but also what our challenges were and what other people trying to do this might need to be aware of. And again, that's something that definitely doesn't articulate from research often in this space. And actually, this is, you know, one of the first examples we saw of that. And what that did was actually start to give us some criteria and some simple sort of, as you can see here, a one-pager to somebody to help better understand how to overcome the challenges that we face, and to hopefully help to embed this technology successfully in schools after we've left, which is something that, again, I'm going to come back to in terms of how we connect those things together. But this was just an example of, we identified that there was a need to capture the challenges we had, how other people could overcome those, and how teachers in particular and schools in particular could overcome those challenges to successfully embed this type of technology in their schools. So in terms of thinking about how that then articulates, or that research then articulates into the real world, or into actually impactful research that can influence positively on the lives of autistic people. What we did then was, I helped to set up a charity, as you can see here, the web links at the bottom left. We helped to establish a charity on the basis of this research and the sort of affordances of what we'd found. And so what we did in this example was we identified that some real world environments can be very scary, daunting, unfamiliar, and provide autistic people with, a complete barrier to accessing them. And in the particular example, we found that employment for autistic people tends to be terrible. Statistically, I'm afraid rates for employment and autism are particularly shocking. So taking that on board and thinking about, well, how can technology provide a mediator or mediate that space? So looking at a job centre that we all know can be very daunting, overwhelming places, shall I say, with lots of people, lots of noises. They can often have security guards on the door in some cities, that we visited. So, they're very awkward places to visit at the best of times. So in a way, they're excluding people from autism from entering them, and then therefore accessing services through them. So we've built a virtual world version. They could sit at home, or actually they could go to a library and they could log in, and they could, through their avatar, through their character, they could enter a job centre virtually, and they could gain access to services. And again, they could use the affordances of text chat, working with an advisor, or they could use chat, as I am now, with headphones and a microphone. But they could use a range of different modalities. But most importantly, they could feel confident using this space and navigating this space virtually. And you wouldn't be surprised to learn that the people who signed up for, and this was a Department of Work and Pensions sort of co-funded initiative. And what we found, as you wouldn't be surprised to hear, is that the autistic people we had entering this service and accessing the services were very successful in finding routes to employment. So the idea that we provided a virtual version of something that in the real world is incredibly daunting and horrible suddenly starts to unlock. So that's how that research translated into practice, or translated into an environment where we felt it could have real world benefit, because the research doesn't just stop at this point, the research should continue through and articulate into these sort of initiatives. So I'm going to talk a bit more about that. But most recently, research we've been doing, which has been placing autistic groups even more centrally to in the way we work with them. So looking back at that timeline, if you remember, of the head-mounted displays technologies, that was first investigated in '96, and it wasn't really until 2016 for a range of different reasons. One of them was because the hardware and software became commercially available, it was affordable, it was portable. We actually thought we would look at that technology again with autistic populations because it hadn't really been looked at in between those 20 years. But what we thought we'd do was actually more than just looking at it again from a top-down approach. We would start our research by asking a sample of this population their views and experiences of this technology. So I've already talked about the idea of autistic people having sensory concerns. So the idea of placing a head-mounted display on them with a set of headphones, you could imagine could be problematic. And unfortunately, there was a lot of propositions in and around sort of media outlets suggesting that head-mounted displays were a perfect fit for autistic people. But again, nobody has gone into that population and asked them, would they be willing to wear it, experience it, would they enjoy it, would they have any adverse effects or negative effects? So what we wanted to do was really just ask questions that focused on them, and we wanted to understand, would you be willing to wear a head-mounted display? Would you experience a virtual environment in this space, and would you feel sick, have any adverse effects, and how would you like to see this technology applied for your benefit, for your endeavors? So like I said, at this point in this research space, it was the typical, the idea that these technologies can fit these groups because it can help overcome some of the challenges they face around social communication and so on. But again, nobody had really taken into account their views, and certainly hadn't asked them, would you want to wear this head-mounted display? So again, the idea of coming to my research lab and put this thing on and let's investigate for our purposes about how this looks, how this works with you. But let's say, would you be willing to wear this? Touch it, feel it, look at it, put it on, try it, have a go with it, and so we wanted to really central those sort of questions with focus on those research questions in our work. So for those of you who maybe are or are not aware, this was what the technology looked like in our first study we did in 2015-16, and you can see the head-mounted displays are fairly small, certainly small compared to what they used to be. They're very immersive, as you can see from the example of somebody becoming quite immersed in the space. So this person's in a coffee shop, leaning on a table. There's a coffee in front of them, and you can see that the person in the real world is trying to pick that coffee up by moving his hand in this example. So these are quite powerful, quite immersive spaces that trick your brain to think you are somewhere else. And so essentially this kit, as you can see, is portable, it's laptop based. We worked with a center in the United States, in Michigan, actually. We worked with the center, so we took the research tools into a center, and that center was helping to support people with autism, but also people with disabilities, broadly speaking, in terms of building employment skills and building routes to employment. So we took this technology there and we were able to investigate it in that space, which I felt was really, really important for the reasons I've described. And without going into the details of what we did, the key focus, as I said, was, would you be willing to use this, experience it, and would you have any adverse effects to it? And what we found was that there was a complete willingness to wear the equipment that we provided, 100% across the group we worked with for at least 2 virtual environments, and we found 95% willing to experience all of the experiences that we gave them. They all used the input device. You can see here we had an Xbox controller, so they were all able to navigate the various spaces that we provided them. And they were all showed some bodily interactions in response to the virtual environment. So just sort of underscoring how powerful this technology might be. They reported high levels of presence, immersion, and feeling natural in the space, which was positive. But most importantly for us, they reported low negative effects. And negative effects in this context relate to cyber sickness, eye strain, not feeling nauseous, feeling sick, and having a headache. Those are considered negative effects associated with this type of technology. So they reported low negative effects, and really importantly, they did not report a higher level of anxiety after using the virtual environment and the head-mounted displays. So again, well, I say again, but what we started to do by placing the individuals we're working with central to this, we really understood a lot more about how they experience these technologies, and we started to understand that actually there could be a lot of positive endeavour in the future with this technology, looking at how they've responded to it in this particular case. But we did want to take that a bit further, and we then worked with younger groups. So the first case study example here in America was with 17 to 52-year-olds, I think we used as a sample. We worked with about 30. And unfortunately, in this sort of space, 30 participants in a study is considered large. So again, that's something I'll come back to later. But we then wanted to look at younger groups. So here we worked with 6 to 16-year-olds across 4 schools in the UK. And we actually worked with 2 special needs schools and 2 mainstream schools. And we worked with autistic groups across all 4 settings. And what we wanted here to do was to, on the basis that these technologies seem to be a good fit and or acceptable by these by the groups we worked with previously, understand what type of preference they would have to what different technologies were available at the time. So you can see here 3 different types of technology. The bottom central image is of a sort of a high-tech, expensive device, which would cost anywhere from £2,000 to £2,500 in terms of having it work completely. The top right device is a Google Cardboard device, which has a smartphone slip into it, and you put it up to your face. And the third device is something called Class VR, which was a device created for use in schools. And both those top 2 devices have a limited immersive experience because they're fixed. So you can only sit down and you can look around a space in a 360 perspective. But the bottom device, you could actually walk around the space. You were actually in somewhere and you felt your body was in the space and you could physically move and walk around that space. The graphics are also a lot more, as we would say, sort of AAA standard in terms of more like a game. So this gives you an example of those interfaces. The Google Cardboard, they were able to walk around the moonscape. The Class VR, they were able to experience historical artifacts such as the pyramids, and in the HTC Vive, they were able to actually interact in a fun fair and play a bunch of sort of stalls, if you like, that you would in a fun fair, from shooting arrows to throwing balls to whack-a-mole and so on. And in terms of what that looked like, you can see here, we had the students work in pairs. We worked very carefully with them. And one of the reasons we worked with those 3 technologies was we wanted to slowly increase the exposure and the quality of that exposure through our studies. So we didn't want to throw them in the deep end, shall we say. We didn't want to just put a very highly immersive technology head-mounted display on their heads and say, there you go, off you go. But we wanted to slowly stage their experiences and work very carefully. And we worked over a period of days doing that as well. But really importantly, I've just got some clips here to play. I'll turn the audio down because that doesn't really add much. But these just are clips to show you what that looked like in the school. And as you can see, this is a cabled device we worked with, which current iterations of this technology no longer have cables, which is a huge advantage. This just gives you a sense of, as again, you can see how that individual was bending down to use the technology. Oh, excuse me. So you can just see how immersed he felt. He was obviously trying to pick something up off the floor in the virtual environment, so he was bending down. And again, you can see here this individual interfacing with the fun fair, shooting some goo, I think, into some clowns' mouths. But again, you get a sense that they're well balanced, they're interacting carefully, and as we found out, there were no negative connotations to anything people were doing in this space. So we worked very carefully and we worked very intentionally to ensure that there was no negative impact on these individuals, and that's a real focus of this research. How do we work carefully? How do we work to ensure that absolutely nobody's going to feel any negative effects in these spaces? And that was something that was also central to the research questions that we had for this project. And this is something that sort of articulates how we worked, ensured we worked ethically, and how we ensured that we increased what we would sort of call an increase in exposure or the ability to sort of engage with this technology over a period of intentional steps, with a view, as you can see across the bottom, that the potential for adverse effects decreases the more that we work in an intentional way. And that intentional way involved things like just getting the children to hold the technology before using it, get them to see it, get them to feel it and see what it was like, put it to their face without anything being on the artifact, right the way through to them being fully immersed, as you saw examples of the pupils there. So I'm not going to go into the detail of this, but this is just to show the sort of steps that we took, and I'm going to go into a bit more of this detail next anyway. So this just sort of articulates this potential for adverse effects can be mitigated and reduced actually if we engage and if we sort of take this technology in the right way into these settings. So this just articulates a sort of journey through how we engaged with this research project. So I want to take us back now a bit to thinking about how this research came about, what informed it, and what we did with it. So I think that's where some of the criticisms have been sort of levied in this area, to be honest, leveled in this area in terms of not working with autistic communities pre-research, during research, and even after research. So I just want to highlight some of the things we did. And now they're not all great, and I'm going to talk about what we might do better. But as you can see here, right at the beginning of the journey in the top left-hand side, May to July, we started to email local schools outlining our project idea, and we wanted to invite input, collaboration, and involvement in our pilot study. And once we did that and we got some schools, agreeing to want to work in this space, we then had meetings with school leadership groups to discuss the project in detail and to flesh out issues they had around health and safety and ethical issues. And we started to listen at that point about what some of those concerns and issues were. I then was lucky enough to be working with a range of autistic individuals at the time, and one of them agreed to be an autistic mentor to me. So again, the idea that I was to be coming up with some research questions without any autistic input just seemed crazy to me. So I actually was lucky enough to work with an autistic mentor who was able to help guide me in formulating research questions, and was also able to flag some issues with the technology as he saw it. He was a technology user himself, so he was able to flag up some issues that hadn't been identified at that point. So in other words, working with the school and working with professionals and also working with an autistic mentor enabled me to formulate a research project, formulate a research set of questions that was actually in part now informed by both of those perspectives. That then led me to be able to complete an ethical review process. And then that led me into doing something that I called a show and tell. So I was able to take the technology into the school and give both pupils and the parents an opportunity to come and experience and to touch it, look at it, and experience some examples of what that would look like on a screen. And so that was something else that we did in terms of engaging the wider autism community. And actually, that was a very well attended event. So, and we put it on around Christmas time, as you can see, and there was a nativity play, so the parents were there. So we used that opportunity to be able to share the project we were doing, why we were doing it, how it was informed, and what the technology would look like. And through that, we had some very good parent engagement. We then went through the formalities of the study. And at all times, we were listening to teachers, parents, and the autistic children in what we were doing. So we had debriefs at the end of every day. We were with them. We were listening to their views. Whenever they gave us feedback, it was noted, and things were changed if needs be. So we were continually listening, as an ethical approach should probably take in this space. But then when the study ended in February, May, February, May was when the formal research project then started. So you can see there's a bunch of stuff that's happened before the project's even started. But then once the project was finished, we then used a range of different ways to disseminate the findings to the teachers, pupils, and parents. So in other words, we then created a bunch of lay materials, a bunch of simple one-pagers, half-pagers, newsletters, posters, flyers, a range of different. We used Twitter, we used YouTube, we used a range of different ways to feed back what we found into the parents and other communities to help understand what we'd found and why it was important, and how by you being involved in this from the outset has helped us to get to where we've got to. So that wider dissemination took part, and that took part, as you can see there, over several months, and that went right the way through to the trust promoting this work. In terms of promoting the findings from this work and sharing what we'd found of this work. So the trust includes 14 schools. So we were able to work with the school and have that then articulate more broadly speaking across a range of communities. And I think one of the things that we did to ensure, and I'm going to talk a bit about the research to practice gap and how we narrowed that. And I think having the autistic mentor, co-designing research question with the mentor and schools, having the show and tell, introducing the technology in a staged manner, inviting their inputs and ideas of what they would like to do with it at that point was important. And then dissemination of those findings back to the autistic and autism community was also vital, I think, in ensuring that in some ways this represented a piece of work that fed into practice quite well. And I'm not saying it did it perfectly, and I'm not saying it's complete, but I'm saying it's certainly moving towards where researchers need to be looking at. So we started off with the autistic input, teacher engagement, the co-formation of research questions. We then looked at the in situ research. So it was in situ, it's in the school. We were adaptable and flexible as the research unfolded, changing things as we needed to, and we continued to listen. We then, once we've done the study and articulated the findings through scientific communities, we then made sure that disseminated into lay autism communities. I'm not suggesting they're the same there, by the way, but we fed into a range of communities and through media. And then what we found was, and you wouldn't be surprised, because we worked in the school, because the teachers could see the benefit, because the children were excited, because the children gave us their feedback and their views on the technology, and the teachers could hear that, that then allowed us to feed this into strategy. So the technology has now been adopted into a 5-year plan for the school, and it also allowed us to feed policy and to inform practice. So the school now does training events, and I help them with it to help train teachers on how to use this technology in the school and where to use it and what to be aware of when working with autistic pupils. And it's also formed into a policy that the school's now developed and written in terms of guidance around that. So again, I'm not suggesting it's perfect, but I'm suggesting it's a move more towards when we involve the communities, when we involve the stakeholders, when we involved the autistic groups, we find a much greater level of success of adoption and work feeding right the way through into policy and practice. So in terms of just taking that a stage further, thinking about the example I provided earlier with the virtual job centre and how the work articulates into other aspects that can support autistic people, we wanted to understand how the autistic children would like to use VR head-mounted display technologies in their lives. So we asked them gave them a range of options around ranging from, as you can see here, I won't read them all, ranging from developing social skills to meeting friends to feeling calm to learning at school. And you can see here the three sort of highlights from this were that they could develop learning opportunities for school. It makes them feel relaxed and calm, and they can go places virtually to see what they look like. So there was this. So by going into this space and asking these questions, we had these 3 key findings that nobody had yet revealed because they hadn't asked the right questions in the right way. So with that information, we then thought, well, how can we articulate that like we did with the job centre into a meaningful piece of work? So what we did was, through identifying those priorities, we actually linked up with, or I linked up with what was then a small SME out of the Bristol VR Lab, which is a fantastic initiative within this space. And what we did was we developed a pilot study in conjunction with a local museum called We the Curious, which some of you I'm sure will be aware of. And what we wanted to do was take the feedback that we've been given here, so it makes them feel relaxed and calm, and they can go places virtually to see what they look like. So Science Week was coming up. They were going to be going to We the Curious in person. So why not create a virtual version of We the Curious so they can experience it at school, look at it via a head-mounted display, because we know it makes them feel a bit calmer. We know it can link to learning opportunities, and we know they can experience it virtually. So what we did was we built, in conjunction with Go Virtually out of the Bristol VR Lab, we built a 360 tour of We the Curious. And you can see this, some examples of what it looked like. I have a video clip here, I believe. And you can see here, this was not as interactive as it maybe would be in the future, but you can see here, you can navigate the space. So you're in a virtual headset. We used a smartphone with a Google Cardboard device because we found that those were very acceptable in terms of our study. So we worked in pairs with the students, and they were actually able to walk around by looking at hotspots, as you can see here, the hotspots on the floor. By looking at those hotspots in the virtual reality head-mounted display, that would then take them and sort of move them through that space. And once they're in that space, as you can see here, they have the chance to look around, 360-degree sort of context, and explore some information about some of the exhibits that they would be encountering. So you wouldn't be surprised to learn we found that the pupils are excited to walk through this. They started to plan their route through the museum when they were going to be going there in person. They started to talk to each other because we worked in pairs to have them walk through this space, and they worked in pairs, talked to each other, talked about what they were seeing. They verbalized what they were looking at. Have you seen this yet? No, I've not got to that point yet. And they actually tracked their route through the museum. And in doing so, and with a sort of by eliciting again some feedback from them, we actually found that they enjoyed the VR app. They found it relaxing, and they found it to help prepare themselves for the visit. It helped them to understand what to expect, and they would like to use this more. After the visit, they actually reported that they enjoyed visiting the museum in person, and they actually reported finding it. They didn't find it being loud and distracting, and maybe that was because they'd visited there before virtually, but we don't really make that connection in a strong way. They didn't find it confusing, and they didn't get lost, which could have been because they had the chance to map that out in their head virtually before they got there. But they did say that they found the app, using the app before, helped them know where things were. They also said that the app helped them to visualize the space before they visited, or 9 of the 10 did that we worked with. And they said that the app helped them feel more relaxed. So this is another example of how we've articulated the findings from the autism community, understanding what their preferences and what their desires are, and how we've then articulated that into an example where it can be usefully deployed and help alleviate issues of stress for visiting somewhere they've not visited before. And the school would encounter all sorts of differences in terms of how people would respond going somewhere they hadn't been before. So the school also reported back to us that this was a great opportunity for them to experience it virtually, and they felt it helped in some way sort of alleviate the unknown in that space. So the interesting sort of conclusions from that were that it seemed that the VR app helped to make them feel calm and relaxed. It helped them to potentially expect what to see before they went there, and that helped alleviate confusion. It helps to heighten the visualization of the space before they go there, and potentially reports of museums being distracting were similar before and after the museum visit. So we weren't exactly sure about what was going on there because we haven't investigated in detail. But this is just, and we haven't investigated in huge detail yet, but this is just an example of how we're using some of the information being provided to us by our autistic communities into real world examples. This is another example. The school that I work with and that we worked with here had a coffee shop attached to it. So some of the pupils get an opportunity to work in the coffee shop, as when they take their post-16 PSHE courses, they have the opportunity to work in the coffee shop and develop employment skills and skills therein. So again, one of the things we were able to do was actually use a virtual version of a coffee shop. This isn't something we've designed, it's something we used off the shelf. And you can see in this space that the pupils could actually go through the process of learning. Just going to move forward here. Go through the process of learning how to make a coffee, and they could do it virtually. So they could do it before they even needed to go into the coffee shop. And some of them reported having some anxiety around that. And they can also focus on the activities and the tasks at hand. So again, in the real world, there would be customers waiting potentially, there'd be a lot of noise, but here they can do it in a very calm, relaxed, staged-wise manner, which they reported being useful to them in terms of understanding the process, the steps, how to make coffee in that calm, relaxed space. So again, this is another example of how we've listened to how these technologies can benefit these groups and sort of put it into practice and put it into an educational context. So I am coming to the end now. I'm conscious I've spoken for an awful long time, and maybe some of it's been interesting, and I hope it has. But really, I just wanted to come back to this idea, and I hope from what I've been saying and the way that I've been articulating the research we've done, that the medical model is not something either I embrace or I understand to be of value in this space. I think a socially driven model that prioritizes listening more, prioritizing more, empowering and co-creating with disabled communities, in this case autistic communities, that will lead us to providing a much more of an enabling experience and enabling opportunities for these individuals. We're not looking to fix, we're not looking to plug gaps, we're looking to enable people. We're looking for people to be able to express themselves and be more enabled. And I think adopting obviously the social model that prioritizes the sort of things that I've talked about, and by doing so, engage in autistic communities. And to take that a stage further, our next project that we're looking at in a school using a robot, funnily enough, we're actually even before we start to understand what the research questions are, we're actually going to be holding focus groups and meetings with the pupils to actually start to ask them, this is what the robot can do. How on earth would that feature in your school? What does it look like? Where could it be? What could it do? So we're going to ask that of them, and from that we're going to formulate our research questions, and we're going to program the robot to do the things that the students would like it to do. That will be done in conjunction with the teachers, so it has a pedagogical, educational connection with it, because I think that is important. But the point is, we're starting from focus groups with autistic pupils, teachers, involving parents, as I've talked about here already. Doing that will allow us to do something with the robot that will be more meaningful, as opposed to just doing something like using the robot to focus facial attention, which is where some of the work has sort of been situated, which for me isn't of interest, but it's rather how can this robot be used that fits into this sort of social model that I've been talking about. So I think working with autistic communities in the examples I've provided and the experience I've had, their voices come to the forefront. There's no doubt about that. Their voices are central both to the research endeavour, but also to the sort of pre and the post-research endeavour. This provides a more empowered individual. I think this empowers the individuals. And I think it also places them central and shows that we value them. And I certainly think from working with other stakeholder groups, parents and teachers, for example, it shows that we value their children or their pupils. And it shows that we value their perspectives. And I think when we then bring those perspectives through in our research and then start to say, well, in terms of your school setting, some of our findings might enable you to do this differently. But I think they're more inclined to listen to what we've got to say if the work has been informed by the voices of the people that they are working with. So we've identified their priorities in relation to the use of head-mounted displays, and that led to a small pilot study that drew on their priorities and their views in our work. And this is leading to this led to co-design and co-created knowledge, which I think is central. This is about us as researchers working to co-create this knowledge with our communities, and in my case, autistic communities, but I suggest this sits across a range of different communities who are underserved and underrepresented. And what we see by doing that, as I've said, is the policy and the strategic change that needs to happen and is taken much more seriously when we present it in this way. Now, I'm not suggesting it doesn't need to be done rigorously and that there is the evidence base behind it needs to be serious, but I'm just saying that I think having the perspectives and the views coming through that will get buy-in from the sort of agencies that we're talking about here, local authorities, local councils, schools, and other spaces. They will listen to that, and they seem to be listening to it in the work we've been doing. So in terms of a reflection of how this has worked or how this has sort of enabled me to take my research forward, because like I say, we're all researchers are learning in this space. I think maybe some quicker than others, but this has enabled me to expand my understanding of the challenges facing autistic people. And by challenges, I mean the way that they are creating their own social sort of contexts. And I think that has also developed ways and methods to include all autistic voices in the work that we do. So I think by expanding my understanding, I've developed ways, and I think we do need to develop ways to be inclusive. So it is easy to say, let's not work with non-verbal groups or people that can't speak because we don't have ways to have them communicate with us. But we need to establish ways to have them communicate with us. And we've worked really hard to do that using things like picture exchange communication systems, using visual material, working with a caregiver or working with their teacher very closely who does understand. And there are ways to work. It's just that researchers can be very lazy when doing so in some cases. So we have, regardless of communication challenges, worked with all autistic people in the projects that we've done, as I hope you can see here. This has enabled teachers and caregivers to take part as well and share their perspectives. And I think that's reinforced that collaboration is essential when working with disabled communities, people who are underserved. Collaboration is absolutely key. This also underscored the need and urgency to actively involve stakeholders more prevalently in our research. And when I say in our research, it doesn't mean in our piece of data collection that we're doing. It means in all parts of our research. I often say this, but doing the research and producing a piece of scientific literature out of that is just one part of the research journey for me. There's a whole 3 months before that has been informed by the voices I'm talking about. And the 6 months after that, comes all the articulation that needs to take place to articulate into lay communities, scientific communities, a range of different communities. And I think that is another part of the picture that is often left behind. Researchers often come in, take what they need and they go, and not much is fed back into that community. And if it is, it's done in a very sort of there you are, there's a one page of what we found, but it needs to be done in more innovative ways than that, actually. So I think technology development will be stunted and will struggle to move ahead in the ways that we might want without these viewpoints included. And when I say in ways we might want, at the moment, technology in this space, in autism and technology field, there are very few examples where technology has been deployed successfully and is still being used successfully on the basis of a research project. And now that's an issue. And I think if we are to overcome that and to have technology more embedded in schools, for example, in the context I've been talking about, we need to do the things I've talked about because we've seen much more positive outcomes from that than doing the work in the way people have done before. And I think ultimately that will enable us to provide technology that will enable and support individuals in this space. This is not in any way about fixing, it's about enabling and opening up opportunities. And hopefully some of the projects I've talked about, you've seen how we've worked with those individuals, and we've also sort of produced material that has helped to enable rather than and it's followed the social model of disability, which I think is vital in terms of understanding and certainly understanding, but certainly articulating into our research practices. So thank you, Louise, for again inviting me to talk today. And thank you for, and I can't see how many people have joined or who is there or who isn't. Apologies, I've gone on longer than expected, but follow up with an email, please, if you have any questions, queries. I'm really happy to talk with people, very broadly about this. It's not about what I've said being completely correct, but if people have issues with what I've said, I'm equally interested in listening to those as I am people wanting to share their experiences and to even potentially become involved in research or collaborate in this space. So thank you, Louise, for the opportunity to speak today, and thank you for everybody for listening to me drawl on for about an hour and 15 minutes. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Nigel. Does anybody have any questions for Nigel they'd like to ask? And also to answer your question, Nigel, we had about 21 attendees in total, which was great. Really pleased. Is there anybody that'd like to ask any questions? You can do the raise hand feature, and if there's no questions, then that's absolutely fine too.
Hopefully I've stopped sharing my screen now, but Louise, are you going to moderate or?
Yeah, I am. So we've got a question saying, how would you recommend finding an autistic mentor?
Questions. Can people still hear me?
Yeah. So there's a question in the chat saying, how would you recommend finding an autistic mentor?
Hello? People have got a question, please feel free to jump in now. I can see there's a couple of hands up. Joe Clough, I think.
Hi, yeah, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Great. I think this technology would be really good for supporting adults, because obviously employment is a big issue. I'm just wondering about how accessible it is in terms of cost. Do you know if there are companies that offer subsidized equipment to third sector organizations or anything like that?
Maybe, oh. Good question. I'm looking at some questions now, so I'm just going to go ahead and stop spotlighting me. I think that will help. Does that help?
Okay, 2 seconds. Let me do that.
Louise, can you hear me yet?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay,
did you hear the question that was just
go on
asked?
with this. I think Louise is. So a couple of questions here about how would you recommend finding an autistic mentor? I mean, if people can still hear me, that's a really good question. I mean, I was lucky enough, as I say, to be working in an organisation that supported employment of autistic groups. So I was able to work closely and make sure I was appropriately informed. It's a good question. That is a good question. And that for me is about having a network, I suppose, and dipping into that network and putting out a call for people who want to co-design and co-create research with you. Oh, no, I can't hear you. Oh. I can't hear anyone. No, I can't hear anyone. Oh, I can hear you.
Yeah, I can hear you, Nigel, but I don't think you're able to hear the question that was asked. I've just asked for them to put it in the into the chat, so I don't really know what's happened.
Sorry. Oh, sorry
That's
about
all right.
that. Oh no, sorry about that. But yes, so the question from Jenny was around autistic mentors. So I think it's about having networks and offering benefits to both parties, obviously. And I've often found that people, in this space have always been excited by wanting to be involved. So I've never had a problem, but that doesn't mean it wouldn't be a problem. I just think you need to make sure you can sort of sell both sides really. Why is it a benefit to them to be involved, and why is it a benefit to you to have them involved? I often find if you find the right organizations and networks, you'll be able to dip into and have somebody put their hand up and say, yeah, I'll help you with that. I think I can see the benefit to that, or the potential benefit to being involved in that conversation. And but it's a good question. It's a good question. There is nowhere anyone can go to say, look, I would like to, work with somebody in this space who is available. And the National Autistic Society have been very helpful. I would say that actually they've been an organisation that have helped support and to flag and to highlight. But if anyone needs contacts or wants to, be invited to, to networks, please just let me know. That's something we can certainly talk about and explore. And we've got another question. So Ian, right, so Aga, sorry, is talking about autistic individuals having strengths and not being considered. At least I'm not aware of any. Would you consider this academic neglect that impacts directly on policies? Yeah, absolutely. I think it's completely. So what you're saying there is it is completely. We are not looking close enough at these strengths. Well, you say that, but I think there have been some good examples of companies now who are identifying that the sort of pattern recognition that some autistic people have in terms of the way that they can see things, have been identified as a strength and being employed in companies that you'd coding and computer science disciplines, for example. Now that does raise the question: is that the right way of employing somebody potentially to exploit their skills in such a way? But I think that's a give and take, isn't it? And I think, but I do consider it to be academic neglect to a certain extent, actually, when we are not recognising the strengths and having that feed and connecting with those societal contexts. So. And Ian mentions UE have a specialist mentors that could be working with students with autism for many years, because it absolutely could be of use. Thank you. Maybe that's to the group broadly, but that'd be certainly of help to me. And I think, let's be clear, UE will have some students work, within its environment who would have declared as being autistic, I would have imagined. And so I think I'm sure UE does a great job supporting those, but there's certainly a space. So it's great to know that you have specialist mentors working with those students. And Joe's mentioned that are there companies that would provide technology that is affordable, and is this a massive support with groups to help with access? There are some companies. There's a really good example. If you look up Florio Tech, I'll put it in here. Florio Tech. They're a company based in Washington in the States, and they've had a lot of press recently, and they're doing a lot of work with VR, and they've developed a range of modules that's quite affordable, and schools and different organizations are buying into that. But the slight angle on that is it is kind of deficit based in terms of fixing joint attention and supporting and fixing social skill problems. So there is still slightly that dimension factored into that. But that notwithstanding, they're doing some amazing work, and they've trodden very much the right way in terms of how they've developed their products. They're very low tech, they're very affordable, but they're very impactful, and they build on all the sort of advantages and affordances that I've been talking about. There's lots of questions coming in now. Let's have a look. And it could be a massive, so I think the employment thing is a huge gap, and we're looking at how we can. So in one example, we were looking at working with a group called Project Search, which is again an American initiative that works with companies such as, in this country, Amazon and I think DHL, for example, big companies. And what they do is they actually work with autistic individuals, and there's a really big one at Bath Hospital as well. And what they do is essentially they work with individuals to autism to bring them into the workplace setting and to develop their skills in that setting, and to provide them with job-specific skills, and with a view that then they seamlessly fall into employment. And that's been a very good initiative. But of course, during COVID, as you would imagine, that's been stunted completely, and they've been looking towards how technologies can fill that gap and plug that gap and provide that transition and that opportunity and that step into employment. So that's a really good point you raise, and it isn't moving quick enough. And again, with the examples I mentioned about the funding routes, funding often prioritises other activities rather than us trying to sort of plug that issue around employment with these groups. Is there a virtual reality system where in the emerging world? There are some good. Adam's asked the question. There are some really good spaces, Adam, that exist. If you send me your contact details, if you're not too shy to do so, if you're able to do that, or I can even probably look them up. I'll just get a quick screen grab of your name if you're a student. There is a really good space that we've created. We've created a virtual reality, co-created it with the University of Kent, a virtual reality platform for autistic individuals, specifically to come and build the island in the way they want, and to have imagined spaces and to relax and chill out. So I can certainly send you the details for that. If you have some VR technology, engage with that. You can even do it on a screen-based interface as well. So I'll send you that. Flo is asking a question around participatory autism research collective, maybe worth contacting. Yeah, agree completely. That's a good point. Thank you. And there's also a participatory network it's the same one you're talking about, it's Park, isn't it, at the University of Kent. Damien Milton heads that up or is involved with that. So that's a very good network. And University College London also have an autism research centre, which is also really well connected with autism mentors. And also And they're doing work in exactly the same way. And also, finally, to mention Autistica, a charity which is headed up by James Cusack-Nell, and again, they work closely with UCL and other research agencies to make sure research is informed by autistic people from the outset. So that's a very good, so those are all good. That's a really good point. Thank you, Flo. Thank you, Adam. I've got your email. I'll follow that up with a link to, I'm just going to copy it out now, so I know this chat disappears sometimes. I'll follow you up an email and invite you to the next session. I've got a feeling it's just been, but I can connect you in with it. Thank you. I've got your email there. Thank you, Aga. That's the UCL department, Centre for Research, CRAE, the Centre for Research Autism and Education, which is a world-renowned centre, and that's where the work that Liz Pelenico did, that I referred to with the A Future Made Together report, was the report that I referred to with the information looking at what research looks like in the space and what it's being prioritised or led by. And Anna Remington is the current director of there, with Laura Crane as the deputy director. So they're a really cool group. And if you ever do want to reach out and to get some advice on involving participants in research and or autistic mentor routes, I think they'd be good starting points, as well as myself. If encourage people to reach out. I'll just put my email in here, just in case that wasn't clear. Okay, Laura, thank you very much for joining us. I can see people are starting to log off. I think we have reached the end of the hour and a half. I didn't expect for a second to be talking for that long, so I'm really sorry. I would have preferred more time for this sort of conversation and debate and follow up. And I think if there is interested in this sort of space, there would be nothing to stop us proposing some sort of lunchtime get together or gathering across UE when things are maybe a bit more back to normal, and or doing it in this format, I guess. But I think there is a need to have a network like this at UE where we can, as researchers and practitioners and people working in these spaces, have somewhere to connect and to kind of pull resources together.
Thank you so much, Nigel. We're gonna close for today's session. Just being mindful of the time. But thank you everyone for joining us, and this will be recorded for people to view again later. And please do keep in touch with the Equality, Diversity, Inclusivity team, and follow us on Twitter, and do fill out the survey, because that is really helpful for us to be able to measure our impact. So thank you everyone, and I will see you all very soon. And thank you, Nigel.
Thanks, Louise. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Wonderful to be here. Thanks. Would have been nice to do it in person, of course, but at least we got it done. Thank you very much.
No, thank you so much. Bye.
Bye.